we started off in a really broad canvas, and I'll try to mimic that as best I can, but I really can't resist. My work is all in villages and with farmers, and I'm going to get very quickly down to talking about what's going on the farm level when I talk about this broader question of the role of agriculture as Africa grows. So the role of agriculture as Africa grows is to go away. It's just one of the fundamental facts about development that whether you look at it as a fraction of the labor force or as a fraction of GDP, as countries get rich, the agriculture goes away. This transformation is fundamental and is what we want to have happen. Every country in the world essentially follows that path. So slightly differently, and there's different peculiarities. But overall, as you become a developed economy, you stop having people working on the land. So I'll stop. Okay. Well, I mean, it's actually, of course, not quite that simple. There's some other things we have to talk about because this process takes decades. And right now, poverty in Africa is focused still in rural areas. Most of the poor people in Africa are in agriculture. Most of the people in rural areas of Africa are poor. And so understanding how agriculture can be transformed is fundamental to understanding how poverty can be reduced. And the reason people are poor in rural Africa is because agricultural productivity is low. Fundamentally, that's the productive foundations of poverty in Africa, is the fact that this is the way agriculture looks for most farmers in Africa. And in fact, this is a great farm. This is from northern Nigeria. And these guys are guys who are doing reasonably well, but they're not going to be rich when you're using technology like this and using traditional varieties of crops. This is intercrop maize and groundnut, which is one of the fundamental farming systems in West Africa. And so agricultural productivity growth has a disproportionate impact on poverty. When we see agriculture grow, we see poverty being reduced substantially relative to any other source of growth in the economy. So that's just for looking at agriculture versus non-agricultural growth and how its returns are realized across income deciles. So agricultural productivity growth is very effective in reducing poverty. And so why do we see such poverty persisting for such long periods of time in Africa? I'm the depressing guy. We've been talking all about great things all day. I'll talk about a lot of people in rural areas of Africa who still remain very poor. And fundamentally, they're poor because they've got low productivity, and they've got low productivity because they're making low levels of profits because there's been very little agricultural transformation in Africa. This is just the path of one measure of agricultural productivity, which is yields. It's not the most relevant, but it's the easiest to measure. And what we see is over 45 years of history, very slow growth in agricultural productivity in Africa relative to the rest of the world. So why is this? The answer is really clear. There's very little intensive use of inputs in agriculture in Africa relative to the rest of the world. African farmers don't use irrigation. There's very little irrigation anywhere in Africa compared to the rest of the world. There's very little use of improved varieties of cereals or other crops in Africa compared to the rest of the world. There's almost no fertilizer being used in Africa relative to the rest of the world. As a consequence, African farmers get relatively low yields and they're poor. Is this a consequence of geography? Is it just that Africa lives in the tropics, and the tropics are relatively bad for agriculture relative to the rest of the world? If you look at a map of agricultural productivity, in fact, it sort of looks that way. Across the globe, productive agriculture is in temperate areas. Unproductive agriculture is in the tropical areas. There's, of course, tons of variation, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it may be that geography is a big part of the reason for this. And that's a depressing lesson, a depressing concept for Africa, because we're not going to move the continent. But one important reason for this divergence in agricultural productivity across the globe is the historical pattern of investment in new technologies in agriculture. There's just an outrageously large gap between investment in research and development in new agricultural technologies in temperate areas versus tropical areas. And this matters in agriculture in a way it doesn't matter in any other sector of the economy because agriculture is location specific. A new technology that works in Nebraska has very little spillover effect for most of Africa. And so research and development in new technologies has to be region specific. And it's just not. This is just public investment in agricultural technologies. And the investment in tropical areas all over the world is dwarfed by investment in temperate areas, and hence has very little spillovers. And this doesn't include private investment in research and development in agricultural technologies, which is essentially all in developed countries. There's essentially none going on in Africa. And so that doubles the size of these gaps when we bring in private research. So one reason for the gap in agricultural productivity in Africa from the rest of the world is because of geography, but mediated by the history of research and technology. There hasn't been development of new technologies that are appropriate for Africa. So maybe what's going on, and this is actually my bias as an economist, is to think that these farmers, who I know in southern Ghana, are doing as best they can, given their technology and given the constraints they face. And so that's something that we think about as economists a lot of the time. People try to do that. And that's also a little bit depressing because it means there's not a lot of big space for immediate gains unless we get investment in new technology. So that's lesson number one. There needs to be vastly more investment in new technology in agriculture in Africa relative to the rest of the world. Fortunately, that's beginning to happen, a lot of it being funded by private foundations. So maybe these guys are doing as best they can, given their constraints and their available technology. But maybe not. If I make that claim in an audience with agronomists, with people from the ministries of agriculture from various developing countries, they get really mad at me because they point to numbers like this. There are huge gaps in the yields that they can get on farmers' plots using the technologies that are on the shelf now versus what farmers get. We're talking increases of yield of 2, 3, 4, 5 times using existing technologies now. So there looks like there might be potential for big gains in productivity on African farms, even given the bad history of agricultural research in sub-Saharan Africa, that there are gains that are as yet unrealized. And so now as an economist, my first question is then, if those gains are there, why aren't people taking advantage of them? People don't tend to leave money on the ground. Those distributors for Coca-Cola are not leaving money on the ground. They're maximizing their profits, given the bad infrastructure that they face. So let me tell you about I could go on now for a long time, talking about evidence that we have about unexploited gains to new technologies or to agricultural innovation across Africa. Now I fall back into my habit of talking about people that I know. So here's a bunch of farmers in Ghana who, in southern Ghana, the way you maintain your soil fertility is by fallowing the land. You cultivate it for a year, and then you leave it fallow for a few years in order to regenerate soil fertility and beat down the load of weeds. And so on average, farmers in a broad area of southern Ghana leave their lands fallow for about 4 years, with a lot of variation around it that I'll talk about in a minute. And so they're getting on average, say, profits of $120 per hectare. So just to give you an idea of orders of magnitude per year. If they were able to increase their fallowing period, we have technical evidence that they could increase their profits by an additional $100 per acre. They're under-investing in soil fertility. And there's huge profits to be made. And so why would that be? Given the current farming technology, there are profitable investments that farmers aren't making. I'll come back to that in a minute. Here's another example from Kenya, from Western Kenya. Work by Esther Duflo, Michael Kramer, and John Robinson showing very high returns to certain uses of fertilizer. Farmers growing maize in Western Kenya essentially use no fertilizer at all. And in experiments on farmers' plots, these authors found that if farmers calibrate it properly, not doing what the Ministry of Agriculture tells them to do, which use a lot of fertilizer, but use moderate amounts of fertilizer properly applied, they can get rates of return of 40 or 50%. That's column 1, second row down, second set of rows down. So there's large potential returns to using small amounts of fertilizer, and yet farmers aren't doing that. Why not? Okay. So the next step in trying to understand this is to try to think of what are the potential what are the barriers that are keeping small-scale farmers from adopting technologies that could yield large returns. People aren't crazy. They're not just throwing away the money. There's reasons why they're not adopting these new technologies. So trying to understand the barriers that small-scale farmers face in maximizing their returns from their land leads us to ask a series of questions, and we could talk about each of these for a long time. But there's a set of barriers that farmers will tell you stand between them and adopting these new technologies. They include things like macroeconomic factors like Shanta D would talk about. It's going to stick. Distorted prices. Prices that differ from world prices. So there might be technologies that would be profitable at world prices, but there's distortions in the markets that prevent people from achieving those prices. Another big part of it is infrastructure and distribution networks, the value chains that we heard about this morning. There may be that you could grow tomatoes really profitably in certain areas, but then they would rot before they would get to consumers. There may be coordination failures at minimum scale. You might need to get a truck in to get the produce out. And unless a whole bunch of farmers are growing the same crop at the same time, it doesn't happen at all. We saw that with pineapple, the development of the pineapple industry in Ghana and in flowers in Kenya. There might be externalities where the use of the new technology by one farmer makes it easier for other farmers to use it. As marketing chains develop, as input chains develop, as knowledge about using the technology spreads. There are problems of land tenure, which I'll come back to in a second. There are labor market failures. You may not be able to hire the right kind of labor that you want. The skills may not be available. Then there's two things that come up in every single conversation I have with small-scale farmers about why they're not adopting a new technology. And one of them is capital constraints. I'd love to do this, but I don't have any money. Now, part of that might be because, it's me, and I might have some. But part of it may be real as well, that there's real capital constraints. Jeff talked about it this morning. The investment in an irrigation for a small-scale plot costs a lot of money. Small-scale farmers might need access to credit to do that. There's risk and uncertainty. When you're poor, when you're up to your neck, and small fluctuations in your income might put you into debt for a long time, force you to sell assets that you've spent a lifetime trying to accumulate, you're very averse to the risk of possibly losing those. And agriculture, as we saw, agriculture in Africa is entirely rain-fed, so there's fundamental risk associated with the weather and the environment that you have to deal with somehow. So I'll talk about those two in a second. And then finally, you just may not know about it. Extension systems in Africa have historically been disastrous. There's been underinvestment in farmer extension systems compared to the developed countries, and farmers don't know about a lot of new technologies. So I'll take a couple more minutes and just talk about how we can try to understand in any given context which of these barriers might be standing between farmers and profitable new technologies. The point I want to get from this slide, though, is that there's an array of barriers, all of which could be operated in any given situation. And you can't generalize about this. It's going to be, some of these barriers are going to be salient in certain instances, some in others. And so there's not a single overall policy that just makes agriculture work in Africa. It's got to be sensitive to the local environment, which is what generates these barriers. I talked for a minute about that fallowing in southern Ghana, how you could make a lot of profit by just leaving your land fallow for a little bit longer. Why on earth wouldn't people do that? There's nothing very complicated about it. It just means not farming your land for another year. Why don't you do that? Because on average, you've got a 20 to 40% chance of losing your land in any year you leave it fallow. because land tenure is very unclear and land is allocated across people within a community by a very political process. If you're politically powerful, if you're a politically powerful male, your chance of losing your plot is only 20% in any given year where you leave it fallow. If you're a politically powerless woman, your chance of getting your plot back if you leave it fallow for an additional year is only 60%. You've got 40% chance of losing your land if you leave it fallow. So it's not very surprising that you don't leave your land fallow for very long, because you might lose it if you do.